So I've been secretly working on an MMORPG for the last couple of months. Why? Because this guy in Quora said it was impossible, and also because I love MMOs. Okay, so I made 2 MMOs in the past, or MMORPGs if you want to be a little bit more accurate. But I stopped working on both of them for one main reason: engine limitation. You see, I made these 2 games using a game engine called Construct 2. It uses visual scripting and HTML5 to create browser games. And as you can imagine, it's not what Blizzard used for World of Warcraft. It's the equivalent of trying to build a skyscraper with a Fisher-Price hammer. And needless to say, my games were glitchy, laggy, time-consuming, and worst of all, they weren't scalable. We found ourselves constantly pestering the creator of Construct, asking for the network's fixes that he promised to make in the past. But time after time, we just received a cold shoulder. And honestly, I don't blame him. Most Construct devs use it for mobile apps, not multiplayer games. Regardless, it was disheartening and it made me take a break from the whole online gaming scene. Or so I thought. Ever since that day, I told the Wizbird community, Wizbird being the second and more popular online game that I made, that we would rebuild the game using a proper game engine. Now, right after we stopped working on Wizbirds, 2 things happened. I started making this little game called Dewdrop Dynasty using a brand new game engine called Godot. And 2, I created this YouTube channel. Needless to say, I found myself busy editing videos, working on Dewdrop Dynasty, and learning this new magical game engine called Godot. And after months of learning and creating smaller projects, I was finally ready to attempt the big one: online networking. It was time to see what this bad boy can do. But I didn't just make one project. No. I ended up making 3 different prototypes over the span of 2 years. But before we dive into the first prototype, a word from today's sponsor: Skillshare. Do you have a specific skill you're trying to learn and can't seem to find a good tutorial out there? Well, Skillshare is the perfect place to start. From marketing and graphic design to computer science and more, you can find classes that will match your goals and interests. I think sometimes we underestimate how important learning is, especially when you're trying to run your own indie game studio. That's why recently I took the class Storytelling Basics by Stephanie Pereira, who's the head director of community education over at Kickstarter. And for anyone who's thinking about doing a Kickstarter campaign in the future for your game, I highly recommend watching it. But the best part with Skillshare is it's ad-free, so you can watch it without annoying ads all the time. They launch new premium classes weekly, and the entire catalog is now available with subtitles and a bunch of different languages. And of course, as always, the first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Check it out and let me know what you think. This is a little 3D survival prototype I worked on called Survival Boys. Yeah, it's a stupid name. And you play as these weird tribal robots called Ooga Boogians. Don't cringe. Anywho, it's a hardcore team-based survival game where you're trying to survive as many nights, and each team has a totem. If your totem gets destroyed, then you're out of the game. Simple as that. I also failed to mention that there's dinosaurs and these bat things called bataclackers. I'm sorry, this game is just notorious for bad names. So I gave myself about 2 weeks to work on this prototype, and I was surprised to see how easy online networking is in Godot. Like, it's incredibly easy to use, especially if you understand the basics of networking. Anyway, so I started out by making 2 penguins move online. Why? Because I thought I was going to recreate my old MMO fantasy world, but in like 2.5D. And guess what? I didn't. Next day, the penguins were gone and the Ooga Boogians were in. Whoa, stay away from me. From here, I just went all out, crafting the ultimate survival game. Kind of, but in reality, I spent 2 days just trying to make this bean man look red instead of green. I added some modern UI, some ambience, some fighting, some fires, big coconuts, wood cutting, more fires, water, and after 2 weeks of hard work and development, I had a pretty fun little online game. I mean, it wasn't like an RPG or anything, but it was a fun little survival game that you could play with friends when it worked properly. But then something terrible happened. Nah, I just got busy working on YouTube videos again, and I wasn't able to work on this prototype anymore for the time being. So why did I even bring up Survival Boys in the first place? Well, it definitely taught me a lot on how you shouldn't make a game. I was having peers make server calls and you could manipulate the server, so cheating and hacking would be super easy. So my goal was to come back in a few months and try it again, but this time focus more on security. It was time for Prototype 2. It was time for Wizbirds 2. This time, I wasn't messing around. I wanted to create a proper side-scroller game that was super efficient, secure, and most importantly, polished. This meant that I needed to spend a couple weeks reading, researching, and watching a ton of Game Development Center. And oh boy, was this man a lifesaver. I honestly haven't seen any other Godot series that explains servers and networking better than than this guy did. So after a month of tinkering, learning about hashing and salting, which sounds like I'm cooking a meal here, I had a pretty stable prototype, and that meant only one thing. It was artwork time. I wanted to reimagine the Wizbirds art style in a more stylized Game Boy Advance style. I also thought about how there's different colors, shapes, and sizes of birds, so I made a customization system so you can perfect and make the perfect bird. After this, I started to design the world around it, adding giant trees, houses with NPCs, and even some lore with these grouchy golem guys. I also took a look at the combat system, and I thought I would redesign it. In the original Wizbirds, you would equip different magic and you'd use it using your keyboard, but I thought it would be better to use your mouse to aim and shoot. It just feels more natural when you're already clicking to use your inventory. Of course, this led me to add some big, juicy tomatoes that you could fight, and for the first time ever, I made the enemies and they were online, so you could fight them with other players. I designed a journal as an inventory system, and I also added a saving system as well, and this is when disaster struck again. But this time, it was kind of for real. And the problem was, believe it or not, the network security. It was starting to have some serious lag and disconnection issues. This was because everything that the player did had to be approved by the server. Basically, the client was just a terminal asking the server if it could do something. While this is amazing for security reasons, it can be incredibly inefficient when it comes to networking, so much so that most MMOs don't even use this method. Now, this was an issue because the whole system was based off of the security, and if I wanted to adjust something, I would basically have to redo it. So, after a couple months passed, it was time for me to work on my next prototype. And for my third and final prototype, I wanted to try something a little bit different. It was fun recreating Wizbirds and all, but I wanted to try something completely fresh. That way I could experiment with the project and not have to worry about pressure from the community of making a game that's faithful to the original Wizbirds. And I called this prototype Mist and Metal. And as you can tell from this wonderful title screen, I wanted to focus on gameplay and less on all the fancy visuals right off the bat. And for Mist and Metal, I wanted to create a proper fantasy world, like in a fairy tale. Even my game Fantasy World back in the day wasn't really fantasy, it just was penguins whacking snowmen. And speaking of the penguins, I also wanted the players to be actual humans this time and not animals, as I've never really made a game with humans in it. Anywho, my inspiration was Robin Hood, Fantasy Life, of course Maplestory, and Dark Souls? You see, the problem with most side-scroller online games is that the movement is really rigid and boring. Maplestory tried to add abilities and ways to travel, but it always felt kind of clunky to me. I instead wanted the combat to feel really intense and exciting because that's what you're doing majority of the time in these games is fighting enemies and grinding. I started out by making some basic debug artwork and characters, then I made it so you can walk and jump around. Ignore that. Of course, it wouldn't be a Fierce game without hats, so I added hats in different colors and faces. Then I added a chat system and emotes. After that, I got busy with combat, adding slashes, rolling, wall jumping, and Elmo? Yeah, I'm not sure why I did this, but I did. Those poor snails. Finally, I worked on an inventory system and saving, and within a couple of weeks, I had a somewhat playable game. And after testing and breaking and more testing with a couple of friends, I decided to finally start fleshing out the world. I thought since this was kind of medieval fantasy and Robin Hood that we should call this Sheer Luck Forest because it's sheer luck if you stay alive. Get it? Get it? I also made this giant castle, and I was thinking this could be the first town where you go in and the door's shut at night and you need to go inside before you get attacked by some tomatoes or something, I don't know. And after making all these barrels and bushes and things, I thought it was time for me to work on the leveling system. After all, this is an RPG, and without leveling, what's the point? And to finish it off, I added a leveling up effect, gold, music, sound, and a little bit of extra polish just to add to the juiciness of the game. You might think I'm exaggerating when I say this, but this was probably the most fun I've had working on a project other than Dewdrop recently. Just seeing all these ideas that I've dreamed about since I was a kid coming together quickly into this quirky little Elmo game was amazing. So if that's everything I did, what happened to it? And what's next? Well, that's the question. It's too hard on me mentally to bounce back and forth between all these projects when I know I still have a responsibility I need to finish. And one thing I failed to mention is every time I worked on these projects is when I was taking a break from Fearth, from Goodgis, from the YouTube channel. This is my downtime to work on something that I was just passionate about. But now that I've created something that I'm really proud of and I want to develop further, I think it makes the most sense to put it on the shelf for now and to finish what I've already started. And ever since then, I've committed to working hard on Dewdrop until I finish it. And for that reason, you probably won't hear about this game for a little bit. Mists and Metal is exactly the online game I wanted to make, and I owe it all to the hard work and research that went into every prototype. And I learned a very valuable lesson. Skills and wisdom comes from experience. Without Fantasy World, Wizbirds, Survival Boys, and Wiz 2, I wouldn't be here today. But I also learned that commitment means that you have to go through with the things that you promised, even if that means you have to put your dream prototype aside for the time being. So what does that mean for all you loyal Wizbirds fan out there? Well, it means you'll have to wait a little bit longer. Something you guys have been amazing at and so patient with. Once Dewdrop is complete, I would love to dive back into the woods of Sheerluck Forest, slaying snails in my favorite Muppet costume. And who knows, maybe even with a Wizbird or two. I real quickly want to give a huge shout out to Rybread, Remtane, Luke the Duke, Skides, James Albert, Heath Sargent, Flower, and Electron PR, and the rest of the fantastic Patreons for making these videos possible. Thank you so much for watching, subscribe for more videos like this, and stay tuned for the future of Mists and Metal. I'll see you next time.